One, two, three. There we go. All right, you clicked on the microphone. All right, you need to have volume down here, and that's about right. Is coming up about four dots. All right. Testing the sound. One, two, three. One, two, three. Okay. One, two, three. Testing the sound. One, two, three. One, two, three.
I'm going to introduce Dr. Aaron May. He's our speaker. This mic is working too. Didn't understand. Okay. Dr. May obtained his MSc and PhD at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon some 16 years or so ago. He has been awarded like that. Don't worry about it. Just go do it. He has been awarded the status of a Fellow of the American Ornithological Society in 2016. And for that, I recommend you just Google it. He is the Executive Director of the Alberta Cooperative Conservation Research Unit, Co-Director of the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute Application Center, and on the steering committee of the Boreal Avian Modeling Project. Aaron was nominated for the Emerald Award because of his specializing in conservation biology. As an ecologist, he has studied the general effects of various human endeavors upon biodiversity. He has studied everything from worms to wolves in his biodiversity studies, but has a particular fondness for birds. Please help me welcome Professor Baines.
Can everybody hear me? Great. Okay, so I'm fighting a cold today, so please, at any point, if you can't hear me, just let me know. So today, we're going to go on a series of stories. And these stories are going to take us from, what we think of when we talk about the oil sands, which is the mines. But we're going to start to get into the details. We're going to come down at lower and lower and lower scales. Try to understand how small and subtle changes to the environment are part of the story that we have to think about. So, where does the oil sands occur? Well, it primarily occurs in the boreal forest of northeastern Alberta. Okay, it's an area that covers essentially an area greater than the state of Florida. And it exists in a vast ecosystem. So this green area that we're looking at is the boreal forest of the northern half of the northern hemisphere. It is the single largest forest ecosystem on the planet in terms of intactness. It basically, right now at this time of the year, carbon dioxide levels are dropping precipitously because this system is starting up. The trees are starting to photosynthesize, the insects are starting to arrive, the birds are coming, the mammals are awake, and things are dramatically changing. In the winter, very boring place. In the summertime, and a biodiversity hotspot in many ways. And it's due to all of these animals coming into the system. Now, when we talk about the oil sands, it's a big area, but it's here, right? It's this tiny little blip relative to this whole system. So one of the most common questions I get, what is the effect of the oil sands? And the answer to that question, I can answer in two ways. One, I can say it is complete and utter destruction. I can use those words. But I can also say it's decimal dust and you don't even notice it. And it really depends on the concept of scale. And what I mean by scale is the idea, if you're looking at right around the mines itself, yes, a large area of habitat has been disturbed. At the scale of Alberta, it's not so big. At the scale of the boreal forest of Canada, it's very small, and at the scale of the entire boreal forest, it is insignificant. And what we're going to do is try to put some of that in context in terms of the mines versus some of the other activities that are going on. Now, this system is driven by natural disturbance, so it changes dramatically year to year. Last year, if you were, working with me, you would have been dealing with the Fort McMurray fire. Right? That was a tragic event for the people of Fort McMurray, but it's a fairly normal phenomenon in the boreal forest. That system burns and it burns regularly. That burning creates a lot of structure. So the tree species in the boreal, pretty boring. It's about 6 species, not very many. But the complexity of the ecosystem in terms of shrub structure, tree structure, trees falling over, the size of the trees, all create a diversity of habitats for a wide variety of species. Now we also have big insect outbreaks. These are a big part of this system. So again, disturbance-driven system. It's not something that's static. It changes all the time. The other component about this system is it's very wetland. It's a very wetland-driven system. About 70% of northeastern Alberta is in fact a wetland. It's not a forest as you would think about it when you walk through the Aspen or things like that. And so it's this diversity of conditions that allows biodiversity to be actually, given the limited number of tree species, the number of birds, the number of mammals, the number of insects is actually relatively high. Now this is the area that we're going to talk about today. And this is again what I want to come back to when I talk about scale. This is the area where mining is or can potentially occur. And the reason that mining can only happen there is that is the area where what's called the overburden, so the trees, the soils, etc., are not that deep relative to where the bitumen deposit is. So you can take it off, mine it, put the original materials back, and presumably, potentially, some point in the future, restore the system. But it is very important to remember when we talk about the oil sands, that is a very small part of what we're talking about. So we have three other deposits, one called the Cold Lake deposit, one called the Athabasca deposit, and one called the Peace deposit. And that bitumen that we can get out at the mines is in all of those places too. But it is too deep to mine. You simply cannot get, you can't take off the overburden in any kind of economically practical way. So what they do in this situation is something called SAGD, or in situ development. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about the differences between oil sands mining and in situ, or SAGD, extraction of bitumen. And they are very different. So that is what the international community thinks of when we say oil sands. And that is reality. That is, to some degree, what it looks like. As we're extracting the resource from the ground, we take the trees off, we take the topsoil off, we put them in a pile, we store them for later. We go in with big giant trucks, we carve up the dirt, put it in the truck, take it to a slurring machine, and we extract the oil from it. We then have giant tailings ponds that we have to deal with, where that's where some of the excess water and some of the excess oil that we can't extract will go. But then over time, we're going to reclaim this. Now, the success of reclamation in this region is we're now starting to see how well it can be. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that because it's not my area of expertise. But there are some success stories and there are some failures in terms of our ability to reclaim this kind of landscape. Now, from the perspective of going back to what's the effect of the oil sands on biodiversity? Well, this is an older slide, so these numbers are actually they're lower than they probably actually are now. But when I made this slide, the area that was disturbed by the oil sands mines was 530 square kilometers. Put that in context, Edmonton is 683 square kilometers. So it's about the size of Edmonton that we've lost as habitat. Now, I've studied birds in this region for a very long time. And I know that there's about 36 birds per 10 hectares. So that's about 200,000 birds habitat has been lost to the mining process itself. Now, the mineable area planned could be as high as 3,400 square kilometers. So we're talking about 1.21 million birds habitat potentially lost. Now, that's a big number. And a lot of people kind of react to that number. And again, they're right in doing so. Right? That area is going to lose its bird community to a fairly significant extent. But the Alberta Pacific Forest Management Area, in which the oil sands sits, right, is about 25.2 million birds in it. Right? So we're talking about 1 out of 25 million birds might be lost. Right? So again, a considerable amount. But if I change that to the province of Alberta, if I change that to the country of Canada, the oil sands itself is a relatively small change because the boreal forest is such a huge system. What I want to talk about now is the rest of the landscape. Okay, so the mines, we can talk about the mines and people will talk about the mines regularly. But we want to talk about the rest of the landscape. So where the SAGD happens, where other energy happens, where a lot of other activities are going on. We're going to call those cumulative effects. And all I mean by cumulative effects is the process by which a series of land use decisions add up. So this is a beautiful picture of a place I used to work back in about 1993. One of the first helicopter rides I got as a grad student, right? Beautiful landscape of aspen and mixed wood forest with a river running through it, wetlands in the background, and you cannot see any human disturbance. Well, one of the things that's happening in this part of the world that you cannot dismiss when you think about this is that the energy sector and the oil sands are not the only people there. The forestry sector has a significant presence, and they create cut blocks. That's a traditional harvest pattern that you might see in the boreal forest, and that's going to delete some older forest. It's going to create habitat for species that like young forest, but it's going to create some issues. We also have to build roads to get to those, right? So these are called landing roads, and there's more and more and more. Linear features are, in Alberta, one of the dominant sources of disturbance. The linear feature density in many parts of northeastern Alberta is higher than the density of sidewalks. Okay, as a context. So that's our access roads. The road network that we have to get to places, it creates a number of issues that we're going to talk about today. But we also have the energy sector, which is using this same backbone. So the forestry sector really was present in much of those three regions before the energy sector really took off. There was some energy development, but not a huge amount. But over the last 20 years, we've had a huge number of what are called seismic lines. So seismic lines are access routes that energy companies cut so that they can get in and explore for the resource and figure out where it actually is. They're usually 8 meters wide. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the shifts in that technology, but they create this basically connectivity across the landscape that allows ourselves, people, to move throughout that landscape, as well as animals to a varying degree, and we'll talk more about that. But then you get a grid like this. Then you add in, you find a resource. That's why we cut those seismic lines in the first place. We have to set up well sites to figure out what the deposit is, how much oil we're going to be able to get, how much natural gas, etc. So we get small perforations in the forest. We have to connect those to market. We've all heard about the market issues trying to get out, oil and gas out of Alberta. So we have to build pipelines. And all of these things change the way humans act, right? So humans, we love to be able to go out in the forest and recreate. But before we had all of this linear feature stuff, it was hard work, right? It was to go for a walk in the woods meant you had to have a compass and you had to have a GPS. And you're walking through the woods, maybe finding a game trail. But now, we have a lot more access to where we can go in ATVs, we can go in Argos, we can go in trucks, and we can get places where we never got before. We're starting to leave more and more of a footprint that's actually going to be there for a long time. So this is a quad trail through an aspen forest. That's basically going to be there forever. That changes the ability for people to hunt, recreate, and that can put pressure on wildlife. And what I'm going to try to show you today is this is what I think is the fundamental issue. We just took a landscape, my pretty picture at the start. We had a whole bunch of little decisions about different activities that all on their own seem fairly small, fairly insignificant, and they've added up, and now the landscape looks like this. Okay? It changes, and it's about all of these little things adding up. That is what I'm going to talk about when I refer to the concept of cumulative effects. So let's go to forestry to start. What effect does forestry have? Forestry and fire. All right, so I told you before, boreal is a fire-driven system. Because it's a fire-driven system, it's going to get young at some point in time. The old forest is going to burn, the young forest is going to regrow. The species that like the young forest with the burns are going to do quite well for that period of time. And the species that like the older forest, they may be at risk if we burn too much at any given point in time. So forestry realizes this and is trying to mimic it. And so what the idea is we're trying to replace, or not maybe replace, but at least manage the landscape in such a way that we're mimicking the effects of fire. And sometimes we do a really good job. This is a fire I worked up near Lac La Biche a couple years ago, and you can see there's not a single large tree standing in front of them all to crisp. And that looks very much like this clear cut. But here is another kind of fire, and there is the forestry, attempt to emulate. This is called retention forestry, and we do varying degrees. This is an extreme example of a single tree left, but there are cases where we clump. But the question is, how well do we actually match those things when we're talking about cumulative effects in this region? And one of the things that's a fundamental challenge for foresters, and that's a huge issue in the oil sands, is the management of the age of the forest. So if we use this red line, and this x-axis represents forest age, and this is the percentage of the forest. In a natural boreal forest, you might expect most of the forest would be quite young, and some of it would be quite old. Much lesser degree, small percentage. But for a forest company, this curve doesn't make economic sense, right? These big old trees out here, they've slowed their growth rate. They're not growing very fast anymore. They're incredibly valuable habitat to lots of species. But from an economic perspective, they're past due. It's time to harvest them. And so what we tend to get is more what's called even-aged forests, where we tend to have 10% 10-year-old, 10% 20-year-old, 10% 30-year-old, 10% 40-year-old. And we don't get this range of variation that we once had from natural systems. So we're seeing a change in the forest by the forestry activities that are going on. Now this is to show you why this matters. These are 4 different bird species. The top is the white-throated sparrow. This is the ovenbird, which I've spent much of my career studying. This is the black-throated green, and this is the bay-breasted warbler. And each one of these graphs shows the density of the birds, how many birds would you find in a given piece of land, and the average age of the forest. And you see you get totally different relationships. Some birds love young forest, and they're going to do great. Others, like mature forest in between, and they'll probably do okay. But these guys that like the old stuff are considerably at risk. This is a significant issue. And why I'm talking about this is that forestry and energy are happening in the same place. And the risk is that you've got forestry operating, making their plan, saying we're going to have this much old growth. That's how many old growth birds we're going to get. And they might be doing a good job of it. But you have the oil sands companies actually clearing some of those same trees that the forestry company said, oh, I was going to leave those ones. Right? And so this is an issue because it's very hard with this many companies on the land base to communicate some of those challenges. Now, at the other end of the curve, we have another problem. So we're trying to emulate fire, okay, or mimic it. We can use different kind of words to talk about that. But young forests that are burned are actually a very unique habitat. A lot of people look at them and go, oh, what a loss. It's horrible, right? We just lost all those beautiful trees. And for you, maybe that's true. But for this bird and for this beetle, it's the exact opposite. This is their happy place. A 0 to a 5-year-old bird will get this black-backed woodpecker and a 3-toed woodpecker will come in massive numbers. They can sense fire. They actually can find fire and they fly across the continent looking for it. And the reason they're looking for it is this is a pyrophilic beetle. That beetle goes to the burnt trees, it lays its eggs there, it creates a ton of larvae, and it actually has heat sensors and fire sensors in its antennae to allow it to find them. Now, on its own, that would seemingly be, okay, good, we've got these birds that can use the fire stuff. But because a lot of people think of young burnt forest as a waste, we do something called salvage logging. And this hasn't happened as much in the Fort McMurray fire, partly because it's so big, but a lot of our past fires, basically any of the trees that burnt, we didn't leave them standing to create the habitat for this blackback and the 3-toed. We went in and we cut them, sometimes at different heights, and we took the unburned part of the tree and left little short stumps. And that's not the kind of habitat these guys like. So you just have this sort of trade-off. You've got the guys on the young end and the guys on the old end having some risks because we're not really leaving as much of their habitat as we once might have. Now, again, forestry, okay, so it's setting the context because honestly, it covers more of the land base than the energy sector does, okay? The forestry sector in Alberta, covers, there's FMAs essentially over the entire province of the forested regions. Now, in the oil situation or the energy situation, we have deposits pretty much all over the place as well. But what these are doing is they're creating a bunch of infrastructure on top of this forestry issue that we have to be concerned about. Now, one of the things that linear features create is a whole bunch of changes to what are called edges. Okay, so this is an example of what I mean by a conventional seismic line. So it's 8 meters wide, and you can see somebody's driven a quad down here regularly. okay? And it's been recently cleared that winter. And the objective was, bulldozer down there so that they could get in and do the exploration that they needed to find out where the oil deposit was. That line might be 100 kilometers long. One line by itself, no big deal. I'm going to show you some images later that show how these lines add up over time. What the energy sector is trying to do to mitigate it. But as biologists, this creates what's called edge. An edge is a very simple concept. This is the trees, this is an opening, we would call this the edge. And at edges, a lot of biotic and abiotic processes change. So wind speed changes, right? The wind comes down like a wind funnel, right? It goes down the seismic line. Precipitation changes, temperature changes, and increasingly we're finding that it changes the way animals move. So a big part of my story today is going to be about the changes in the way animals move in the landscape because of these linear features. So this is to show you kind of the magnitude we're talking about. So there's 90,000 kilometers of seismic lines. And this is, again, an older slide. 10,000 kilometers of pipeline and 33,000 kilometers of road, disturbing about 133,000 hectares in the Alpaca FMA. Alpaca is about 6 million hectares in size. In the old days, that was done by a bulldozer, a D9 Cat. Now we're switching that technology, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a second. Now, sometimes the lines recover, and that's great, but sometimes they don't. And it's this sometimes they don't thing that is creating a number of issues where things start to add up. Here we have a line, there we have a line, there we have a line, there we have a line. Each one of these is what's called a low impact seismic line. And if you looked at it, then you measure it out with the sidewalks to your neighborhood. There's more lines than there is sidewalks. Okay? So this linear features is changing the landscape. Now this is a map that shows how birds, what they think about those lines. So these black lines represent conventional seismic lines. So an 8-meter wide gap in the forest, not very big, right? But basically what the birds do is they say, well, that's a lovely place to put a fence. Perfect. I'll live on this side, you live on this side, and we won't fight. So it's basically the same idea as you having a fence with your neighbor, right? It provides the boundary that defines one person's property from another. The birds kind of do the same thing. Now, everybody except, Buddy Bill here, who decided to be a jerk and come in your yard. But the basic premise is these birds are treating this whole dissected landscape as if it's fences. Now, on its own, that doesn't seem like such a big deal. But, oops, back up. If you add that up, and we keep adding more, then more, then more, then more, then more, right? The fences result in less and less space than you would expect. And the birds basically have to pack into the remaining features. And at some point it gets so extreme that the birds no longer can do it. Now thankfully, the energy sector has recognized that conventional seismic lines have this problem. I'm going to talk about a couple of other issues with them after. So they're changing their practice, and that is great. And that's something that, by doing the kind of research I've done, that's what's changed their perspective to some degree. This is what's called a low impact seismic line. And you can barely see it, but it's right there. And these are some examples of them. These are now 3 meters wide. So they switched technology, made them much narrower, and that allows them to regrow much faster, not knock down as many trees, and things like that. So that's all very positive. But the negative is that part of this came from a need to make the lines even denser. So those lines are actually 40 meters apart. And there are entire townships, so 100 square kilometer areas, where there are lines 40 meters apart, right? And so you can just find line after line after line after line after line. And that, again, based on those changes that I talked about in terms of animal movement, abiotic processes, that can affect wildlife. Now, thankfully, for birds, they don't care.
Why would they have to make lines 4 meters apart? What are they?
Okay, so to highlight the reason that the lines are 40 meters apart. Okay, 40 meters apart, but they typically are about 3 meters wide. Okay, so the line itself is 3 meters wide, 40 meters apart. Basically, when you do a SAGD development, so steam assisted gravity drainage, you have to understand your deposit extremely well. And to understand it extremely well, basically how we do exploration is we plant dynamite in the ground, we send a shock wave into the ground, a series of receivers, they're called can't remember the exact name right now. The receivers receive the signal, and then that's what allows the geologist to map the deposit. The resolution that's required to do steam-assisted gravity drainage requires that kind of spacing, is the rationale for it. So in the case of 3D seismic lines, which is what that technology is represented by, birds, thankfully, if these represent the seismic lines, these blue lines, birds don't treat them as a fence anymore, which is good, because if they did, the birds would be gone. They simply would have no space. Their territories are too big to fit between those lines. But one of the things that happens is the birds actually have to expand their home ranges. They're bigger. They take more space to actually get the resources that they need. They get a little bit less food in these environments. And that requires bigger territories, which results in slightly fewer birds than you might expect in an area that didn't have these 3D lines. Now, lines are one thing, and lines are about exploration. They're about moving products, moving energy products to market. But to make that product move, we need a whole bunch of very large infrastructure. And this is what's called a compressor station. And this compressor station has a massive fan on it and a massive motor. The massive motor is intended to pump the oil or the natural gas through the pipeline system from Fort McMurray to Edmonton, down to Hardisty, down to Chicago, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To keep those engines cool, they need these massive fans. These are extremely loud. They're at about here, which is about 80 to 90 decibels, where a rock concert is about 100 decibels. Okay. So if you guys want to go party it up and listen to a rock concert and lose your hearing, it's quite easy to do. Rock concert. Well, these systems, they're not quite at the level of people losing their hearing, but they're very loud. And they're 24/7. They run all the time. To give you an idea of spatial scale, that's an oil drum barrel right there. So that gives you an idea of how big those fans are. These are connected throughout the entire pipeline system and make a lot of noise. And what we've done is we've looked at, well, birds obviously have to live in this place. Birds sing. Birds sing and hear each other. So they're using singing to communicate. And what we found is that in these noisy places, the birds actually aren't communicating particularly well. So two things happen. A whole bunch of species can't be there. It's too noisy for them. They just leave. Okay? Some species can stay, and they adjust their song a little bit to try to make themselves better heard. But interestingly enough, they actually aren't able to attract a mate. So this is an ovenbird, and the male ovenbird can sing, is there, in reasonable numbers around compressors. But when those males are singing, the female can't hear him or can't understand him or is not communicating as well. And so those territories are not selected, so you're less likely for those individuals to breed. Right? So the noise is reducing the quality. And this is an area over about 200-300 meters away from the compressor station. The quality of that forest habitat, even though it's forest, even though it's got the bugs, even though it's got everything, the noise is such that it actually reduces the quality of the habitat for the animal. Now, the big thing, I'm going to talk a little bit about this in the context of birds, but I'm also going to talk about it in the perspective of white-tailed deer, moose, and caribou and wolves. These linear features are made for one reason, to make life easy for humans. So they're easy to walk down. And I will tell you right now, as a biologist, I love it when I come on a cut line or a pipeline, because it's way easier to walk, right? And it's way easier to drive. And guess what? Bears are just unique. They're the laziest animals on the planet. They love to walk up and down these things, right? It's got good food resource when the grass grows up. They love that. They love a lot of the flowering plants that grow up on pipelines, and they like the fact that it's easy to move. So there's lots of evidence, and we've studied this to a great degree, that shows that black bears basically like to follow these linear features. Now, why does that matter? Well, here's a video of my friend, the Tennessee Warble. She's hanging out. She just left. Why did she leave? Well, Mr. Bear thought he'd have a snack. So the changes in predator dynamics, predator-prey relationships from linear features is a concern. Now, it doesn't always have massive impact, but in some cases it's had huge impacts. I'll talk about that when we get to caribou. Oops, next slide. But because you all felt bad for that little bird, I want to highlight who the really bad boy on the block is. All right. Who do you think is the #1 predator of birds in the boreal forest? ATV vehicles, okay. All right, so humans, all right. Anybody else? Predators, anybody got a predator in mind? Weasels, all right. Well, we'll see. There's songbirds ready to eat. Mom, bring me food. No, that's not Mom. That is the #1 predator of songbirds in the boreal forest. It's the red squirrel. Now, why I showed that was A, to make y'all do that, and B, I wanted to show it because it talks about something that we are quite concerned about in almost any landscape, and it's what's called mesopredator release. Now, it's not happening in the oil sands yet, but I studied this phenomena in fragmented agricultural landscapes, for example. And when a landscape gets extremely fragmented, and there's not a lot of habitat left, but there's still forest out there, the songbirds do extremely poorly. They're heavily predated, and one of the things that predates them is squirrels. The squirrels do really well in woodlots, people's backyards, and that kind of stuff. And the reason being, their predators don't exist there anymore, right? So when you lose a top-level predator, another predator can move up the food chain and alter the entire predator-prey relationship. And so this is one of the things that we're starting to see is happening in the boreal forest in certain places. All right, so something a little happier now. So this is a Swainson's thrush, and she's trying to figure out which of these 5 or 4 starving children should get the food. Okay. So understanding sort of who eats you and what you eat are the 2 major questions in biology. So understanding the predation and how predation changes is fundamentally important. And understanding how the habitat that you've got influences the food that's available to you is also fundamentally important. And what we're finding is that there's a huge variation in the number of insects that are in the boreal forest. In any given year, it could fluctuate by 3 orders of magnitude. You have dramatic differences. And that's what these big bars mean, and all the jump, all the variation on that graph. But the one thing that you can highlight, and it's not a huge effect, but it is there, is that the distance to the edge of a pipeline and the number of insects that we can get in the ground. So if you just take a sample from the ground, where we stick basically a pipe in the ground and we pull out all the bugs and then we count them all, we find fewer bugs on average right at the edge of a pipeline or on the pipeline than we do in the forest interior. So there's a slight reduction in food supply. Now, exactly how much that affects birds' productivity is something that we're still working on. We don't know exactly the magnitude by which that has an effect or does not have an effect on the number of young they produce or things like that. But anything that puts a stress on a bird, right, is going to have it's going to create a risk. So these changes in insect communities created by the edges that we're creating are altering the food supply for birds as well. But there is an insect that is doing extremely well. Okay. How many people have earthworms in the backyard? Everybody. Okay. How many people go fishing with earthworms as bait? Very good, because it's illegal. Okay. This graph shows something that most people don't know. This is the edge of the last glacial event. That's where the glaciers were. And it is assumed that earthworms went extinct during that last glacial event, or the series of glacial events that occurred. Yet we have earthworms in Alberta today. Now, most people think, well, okay, then the earthworms just came out of, the United States, the areas that weren't glaciated, and have moved up. Now, that may be true, but there's no evidence that that's true. Because all of the species of earthworms that we have in the boreal forest of Alberta are actually from Europe. So they're invasive. They're not native to this continent. They've been introduced. And there is evidence, if you actually read the Mayflower accounts, of people saying, hey, where are the earthworms? And then going, hey, I'm going to tell Buddy in England to bring some over when he comes next time, and bring the earthworms in. Now, a lot of us think of earthworms as positive, and they are in certain situations, in agricultural fields, in our gardens. not so bad. Probably some of you have them in your front yard and you don't like them so much, right? Because they can actually make a mess of your yard in certain situations. So the idea here is I wanted to study and see, this is a very subtle change. These earthworms aren't supposed to be here, but are they in the boreal forest? And if they're in the boreal forest, are they everywhere? Or are we playing a role as humans in moving them? And the answer is we're responsible pretty much 100% for where earthworms are. Humans are the main driver. So what this shows is the proportion of places occupied, a boat launch, a road, the far shore of a lake, the interior of the forest, a seismic line, and the interior from a seismic line. And what the number shows is the boat launch has the most. We have earthworms at almost every single boat launch in the province of Alberta, in the boreal forest. We have a lot of them at roads. When we get into more remote locations, we don't have them anymore. And the reason being, we think, is two primary mechanisms. One, fishermen are taking earthworms from the city of Edmonton, city of Calgary, Bonneville, your local community, and taking them with them to go fishing. At the end of the day, when they're done with them, they might still be alive, but they don't want to take them home. They just chuck them in a bush, and an earthworm population can establish itself. Roads also can move earthworms. So this is what's called a cocoon. Right here is a tiny little egg sac that has 11 baby earthworms in it. Those baby earthworms are parthenogenic, which means that they can actually self-reproduce. What that means is one earthworm can start a population in an instant. These get stuck very nicely in the treads of our boots, in our quads, in our trucks, in our cats and things like that. So when we look at roads, we have a huge distribution of earthworms there. Now, earthworms now are at these places. The question is, what's happening? Are they spreading? So if you look at a 10-year-old road, the yellow represents no earthworms. The orangier colors represent sort of the abundance of earthworms, and this would be the road. So we have some, maybe 20, 30 meters from the road. There's another road 10 years old, and there's another road 10 years old. Here's 40-year-old roads. That's the distribution of the earthworm, that's the distribution, and that's the distribution. So the earthworms, we're dropping them off at point locations that we've created. Okay, the roads, partly by energy sector, forestry, and recreational development. The wells that we're creating, we're dropping stuff off there. And the earthworms are expanding. Now, earthworms, I'm only using it as an example because there's many other invasive species, non-native plants, for example, some other non-native insects that we bring into this system and can spread from these areas of disturbance that we create. We're getting there. So this is to show what the current distribution in Northeast Alberta would look like. That's the distribution of roads. That's the time since those roads have been built, when the earthworms would have been introduced. So about 9% of that FMA is weighted. That's what 2050 is likely to look like with road development and earthworm invasion. There's the answer to your question. Here we have a forest floor in Minnesota without earthworms, and there it is with earthworms. Okay. The reason being, earthworms are an ecosystem engineer. They change the environment to suit themselves. And what they do is they tend to break down the leaf litter very, very quickly. They grab the leaves, they consume the leaves, they pull them down into the soil. And when they do that, they change the actual soil profile. And it's a considerable and a dramatic change. Now, plants that root in the leaf litter, so they have very shallow roots, are not going to do well in that environment. So the earthworm is actually changing the forest understory in Minnesota to a high degree. We are seeing it change in Alberta, not to the same magnitude as what we see here in Minnesota, but this has been identified about 3 years ago. It was identified in one of the journals that I read as the #1 conservation threat to forests in North America. So the people are really concerned about this because of the role that the earthworm will play. They change carbon dynamics, they change a lot of different things. But somebody likes worms, right? And everybody knows that earthworms like robins. This was actually, I call this a kindergarten paper, but I got it in a really good journal, because I basically showed that where you have earthworms, you have robins. And where you have no earthworms, you're very unlikely to have robins. Okay, so the two are facilitating each other. And so you're changing the community because the robin isn't honestly a big boreal player. They're there, but they're not in huge numbers. But when we get earthworms and we get close to edges and disturbances, robins start to increase. And the question is, does that result in competition? If a robin goes up, a robin is big. It's actually a relatively tough bird. They're fairly aggressive, and they might actually, have negative effects on this Portland hermit thrush. Very similar life history. They're actually related to each other, but that bird may be less competitive with robin, and we could see some competitive exclusion. Okay, so I'm going to shift my story a little bit now from birds and insects and tell you the exact same story using the mammal community instead. So, this little guy here, we love them all, the white-tailed deer. The white-tailed deer is in the boreal forest of Alberta. Historically, was not really there. It was in very low numbers. And in fact, at some point historically, perhaps like at the turn of the century before Europeans arrived, it might not even have been in Alberta at all. So it's a species that's expanded its range into the province. And what we've learned is three primary things about this animal. One, when we harvest the forest, we make younger forest. It makes better browse, better food for them, so they do better. Linear features, they're lazy just like bears, you like to walk down them, and there's also food there. And there's also increasing evidence of climate change having an effect on deer. So this is the 1960s, and this is what's called the Winter Severity Index. And this red line represents what a biologist would tell you, deer can't make it north of that line. It's too cold, there's too much snow, they're not going to be able to make it energetically throughout the winter, they'll die. And in the 1960s, that was about the range where the deer was. In the 1990s, you can see that number, that line has jumped all the way north to Fort McMurray. Okay? And that is mainly because of our winters. And this crowd probably more than my daughters can recognize that winters are a little bit warmer than they used to be, right? And that has changed the ability of the deer to persist in this landscape. Okay? Well, that's not necessarily good or bad, it just means the deer are able to do better. It's a combination of the energy sector, the forestry sector, and climate change. The ultimate and cumulative effects. Those three things are leading to more deer. But why does this matter? And this goes back to the idea of competition that I just talked about with the robin and the thrush. But it's a little bit more complicated. We have something that we will call apparent competition. So this beautiful animal, the gray wolf, has also increased over the past 20 to 30 years over. We don't hunt it as much, we don't trap it as much, so its numbers have gone up. In addition, its prey, the moose, is its primary prey, has actually recovered from a variety of disease events that happened in the 1960s and 70s. So moose were going up. Moose also like logs, they like winters, and they also like pipelines. So moose are going up, and deer are going up. So both these prey items that are easy for wolves to catch are going up. That leads to bigger wolf populations. Having a bigger wolf population means more wolves are running around on the landscape. Then we got this cute little critter, who's not the brightest light, called the caribou. Now the caribou live in completely different habitat than the moose and the deer. And historically, they lived in a completely different habitat than the wolf, and that's how they stayed safe from it. The caribou lived in the bogs and the fens and the places nobody else wants to go, and the moose and the deer and the wolves all lived in the uplands. Okay. Well, that's been changing, and caribou have been changing as a consequence because the competition they're having with the moose and the deer comes through the predator. The predator is what drives the caribou down. It's not direct competition between moose and deer because they don't eat the same thing as caribou. It's just that by creating conditions that make for more predators, the caribou incidentally get predated upon. So this is just to highlight what we know about woodland caribous. There's about 3,000 caribou currently in about 12 main herds shown in the red there. And if you look, a large area of that oil sands development I talked about sits right smack on top of caribou range. So all these linear features, etc., are adding up and having an effect. Now this is what a caribou would like. They like large patches, low productivity conifer or peatland. So the only main things from the perspective of habitat that's happening there is seismic lines and pipelines get put through this environment. That's not so good for caribou. As well as sometimes we disturb it for the mines themselves, or sometimes we disturb it for the well pads, those kind of things, but there's no forestry activity in this habitat that they use. But this is the population on the east side of the Athabasca. So what we have here, one would be a stable population, so the population would be not changing, and that is what's called the population growth rate. It is just dropping. Okay. Caribou are not doing well. This shows you every single herd in the province. This is from the Minnesota Polar slide. Those are all the herds on the bottom axis. One would be that population is stable, it's not changing. Above the line would be it's growing, and below the line would be it's declining. And you can see the vast majority of them are declining. Caribou are not doing well, and it's because climate change, the increase in deer and moose is leading to more wolves, and a couple of other things that I'm just going to show you here. So wolves eat caribou, and the idea has been historically, caribou avoided wolves by going in this crappy habitat. Wolves were like, I'm not going in there. That's too hard. I don't want to walk in there. Oh my God, that's awful. Trust me, caribou habitat is the most horrible place to walk you've ever thought of. But with these numbers going up of of moose and deer, we're actually exceeding what we call the alternate prey threshold. And so we have more alternate prey out there in the landscape that's leading to wolves doing extremely well. Now this is to show you why this is now changing and why caribou are being affected. So this is the caribou range that I was talking about with a massively declining population. And these are the wolf packs of the 1990s. So you can see they stayed basically out of the caribou range. They didn't go in there. They were happy enough to hunt around the edges and eat the moose and the deer and things like that. That's the wolf packs of 2006 and 2007. So there's more of them. And they're going into caribou range. And the question is, why are they going into caribou range? Well, there's a couple of reasons for it. Sorry, one other slide before I forget. In the 1990s, this is the diet of wolves in that area. So what we have there is the 1990s are the gray bars, the black bars are the 2000s. Caribou were basically not a part of the diet in the 1990s of the wolves, and they become a more considerable component in the 2000s. And again, but also look at deer, right? Deer have dramatically become a bigger part of the wolves diet. So it's not the caribou is making the wolf population go up. It's just an incidental byproduct of more wolves and wolves going into caribou habitat more often that leads to this. Now the reason that we think wolves are going into caribou habitat more is twofold. One, there are more wolves. They've got to find food, so they're going to go more places. And that's probably true. But the second thing, the thing that has the most to do with the energy sector and the oil sands, is these linear features. We know from a variety of technology, wolves can move about 3 times faster on the lines. And so we also know that caribou mortalities are closer to lines than you would expect due to chance. So it would suggest that this increase in movement rates that we're seeing from wolves and from other predators might be the reason that caribou are interacting more with predators periodically, more likely to get killed, and that's why the population is declining. Now caribou seem to know this, right? And all this graph indicates is that during certain times of the year, they avoid linear features. They try to stay away from them. They get that they're a risky environment. But as more and more lines add up on the landscape, that gets harder and harder and harder to do. And at some point, it actually becomes impossible. You can't avoid them because there's so many, as I talked about before. So the energy sector is trying to fix this problem in a variety of ways, one of which is we're trying to block the line. We're trying to put trees down across the line to make it very difficult for animals or anything else to move on it. There's a variety of other solutions that I can talk about later if people are interested as well. So, the future. We don't really know, right? Obviously, the economics of today make the oil sands less viable than they were when I created much of this talk. So whether that same development intensity that we saw in 2010, 2011, whether that's going to be manifest with the whole region is still an open question. But if it was, if the trajectories we were on in 2010, 2011 came to pass, this is my study area. That's what the world looked like. I made this slide in 2006. The proposed development that we were going to have in Alberta looked like that. That is what we planned to do as Alberta. We gave the energy companies permission to do this. And so these are the consequences of these choices. Right? Now, there are trade-offs. This is, it's called Highway 81. It's called, Highway 81 is the area we're going to do this. Maybe that's the right thing to do. But then we've got to start thinking about, well, does that mean this area here is a complete no-go ever again because we need protected areas? And maybe other parts of the province, and we have to start thinking of shifting our land use to say, maybe we'll only have energy here and maybe we'll protect areas, rather than trying to sort of fix everything everywhere. I think that's an important question. So just trying to wrap up. We need to try to find a balance. I've told you a whole bunch of stories today about there is effects, and there are clearly effects, and it's known by the government, it's known by the public, it's known by academics, that what we're doing is having negative repercussions to biodiversity. Those challenges are going to grow if we do more. So we have to make decisions about, is the oil sands region economically worth it to have, biodiversity decline to that degree? And if so, if we say yes, are we going to protect it somewhere else, or are we going to let everybody do everything everywhere? And right now, that's kind of been our policy. We're shifting a little bit, but there's been this kind of mindset that we can do everything and everything will just be fine. And I think the reality is that's probably not true. So with that, I'll just close with a couple of slides and take any questions.
I will help legal with the questions by reading this last speaker here. Go ahead, question.
Yes?
If you were in government in the province, what would you do?
Okay, so the question was, if I was in government and I was with the province, what would I do? And I would be scared to answer that question. I really do think what we have to start thinking about is a zoning and a threshold perspective, right? That resource is worth a lot to the province of Alberta. It runs our economy, and we need to start shifting that economy. I would say that would be my first thing. But we're not going to shift it tomorrow. There's a lot of places in the northwest part of the province, in the northeast on the Northwest Territories bound border, that are still very intact. They're pristine ecosystems that we haven't been to. And but the question is, are we going to say enough is enough? We're going to protect those and they're going to be set aside. Now the province is working on things like the land use plans to make some of those decisions. They have set aside some protected areas. As to whether they're big enough, I think is a very large open question. I want to highlight that the energy sector, and I work with them very closely in all of this research, they always are trying to do better. What I mean by that is they went from 8-meter seismic to 3. Sometimes some companies have actually looked at that noise problem and tried to make them quieter. And I applaud them for that. What my problem is that we're still adding more and more and more of the 3-meter. And the noisy stuff, it's not quite as loud, but it's still loud. So we're still adding more and more and more. And at some point, it's just got to be, this is where it's enough. We have to say this land is set aside for something else, and this land is set for this. And I think that would be sort of the perspective I personally would take. At the back?
I could, if I stay on Ontario, come up to you. You can hear it.
I heard a talk quite recently that most of the land, or large proportion of the land in Alberta is covered land, called the exact percentage, and that virtually every tree on that covered land is already committed to some forestry company. And the same applies to the land underneath the Focus Water that was covered by planning ordinances. Is that correct?
Yeah, the answer to that question is, yeah, it's called the green zone, is what we've, oh, sorry, the question, just to reiterate, so the people on the other side of the room can hear, is that the vast majority of land in Alberta is now owned by the Crown, and then the second part was most of it has been allocated. And the answer to that is yes, most of the land is owned by the Crown. So in the Canadian Prairie and the Aspen Parkland, most of that land is privately owned with a very few small provincial parks and things like that. But when you hit what's called the green zone, which essentially starts at Athabasca, Lac La Biche, Hinton, those kind of places, that is officially Crown land. Now that Crown land means we provide a lease to the company to use that land. They can use the trees on it, they can use the oil resource, they can extract the diamonds, and that land is all leased. Now to say all of that land has been allocated is not quite true. Wood Buffalo National Park, for example, the largest chunk of it is in Alberta, and it's a huge area, and that is owned by the federal government and will never be allowed for because it's a national park. Our national park systems, obviously up and down the Rockies, have a big effect. But in the land that's been allocated, that's called green zone, I don't know the exact numbers, and I won't pretend to make them up, but I would say it is a very significant proportion of it has been allocated. With the exception of some places along the Northwest Territories border, in the northwest corner, and in the central area just to the west of Wood Buffalo National Park, those are areas where very little human industrial activity is developed, and they're sort of our options left for provincial protection of certain areas and resources. Yes? Okay, so the question is reclamation on the tailings ponds, what's happening on that? So I'm not going to profess to be an expert on reclamation strategies and things like that, but the current policy is that it's like for like. So you're supposed to restore it to what it once was. So the energy companies are spending a very large amount of money trying to return many of the tailings ponds and the areas of the mines themselves to what's called fen habitat. And fen is this wetland type of environment that has the black spruce, it's what caribou like, etc. It's a very challenging thing to reclaim. And so there's been some success stories and there's been some pretty big failures. It will not be that the oil sands, when we recover it 50 years from now, 60 years from now, we can put a forest back. But whether we can put it back to what it was, I think is the ultimate question. Can we grow an aspen forest? For sure. Could we grow a pine forest? Absolutely. Can we create a graminoid fen? Not so sure. Right? So that's, I think, the big thing for the energy companies is they've been trying to go what's called like for like, and that's one of the fundamental challenges. But Suncor's original mine is now, right, that original footprint is in the recovery process. They're starting to put it back together, and that stuff will then be returned back to the Crown once it's basically approved that it's no longer Suncor's responsibility. That's how well pads work, for example. When you have a small well pad and you, a company, have no longer a use for it because you extracted the resource that you want, you're required to plan it back to some kind of condition that's acceptable to the province. Once that's done, you get a reclamation certificate, and the province takes that land back. That's how it works. Yes?
I believe it is that the environment is important.
Yeah, I will. I'm just going to make sure I phrase it right. So I believe the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, is there an economic evaluation of the biodiversity itself? Yeah, okay. So the question is, I think, and that's a big question, is biodiversity economically worth it? And the answer to that is, I think it's an absolute yes. I think one of the best examples of where we're struggling with it right now is with bees, for example, right? Pollination is a service provided by bees. And bees are declining as dramatically as many of the things I just talked about for a lot of different reasons. We lose bees, we're hooped. Okay? It's over. It's Armageddon. And we need to do something about it. And so there is actually policies in place that have looked at the economic benefit of bees relative to not having them, right? And so it's huge. The dollars are massive. Similarly, people have done things like water and the ability of clean water in northern systems, right? Like, what's the value of that water resource? And the math on that depends very much on your perspective. And what I mean by that is, if you do it from the amount of clean water, its availability to people and the plants that do that cleaning, It's trillions of dollars is what people have estimated it to be. But it's $1 trillion resource that's so far away from where anybody wants it that it's not going to be utilized in that way, right? So the answer is there's lots of economic models that have been done to say this is the value of X, this is the value of Y, the value of Z. And where does that play out relative to the value we get from an oil sands development, et cetera? And it really is perspective driven. I can't tell you that there's an answer that it's an oven bird is worth $1.45. I can, but when I do that, it's to a bird watcher, right? But if you don't bird watch, you don't care, right? So it's not worth $1.45 to you. So that's what I'm getting at. It really depends on perspective.
I think we should maybe cut it off at this point, and I'd like you to help me giving